It's me crazy.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today at Human Resource Executives Ask HRE Live Q&A. I'm Kathryn Mayer, the Senior Benefits Editor at HRE, and I'll be the moderator during this event in which we'll be discussing COVID-19, paid leave, and the ADA. I am joined by a fantastic panel of experts that know these topics inside and out. We have Jeff Nowak, who is a shareholder at Littler Medelson. We have Tamika Newson, Assistant Vice President and Legal Counsel at Unum's Employment Law Group, and Daris Freeman, who is Assistant Vice President and Legal Counsel at Unum's Employment Law Group. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Kathryn.
And I've talked to you guys a few months back now about these topics, and a few months is a lifetime when it comes to this fast-changing environment. So I'm really excited to revisit this and dig into this topic. And a note to people listening in, you can ask questions for our speakers today in the comment section. So take advantage of that opportunity, and we'll get to those questions as time allows at the end. So without further ado, let's get started. I know we have a lot to dig into. So Jeff, I think let's start with you. So you, of course, write the popular FMLA Insights blog, and you're a leading authority in the US in regards to these topics. So tell me about what are some of these key family and medical leave challenges that you're seeing as we continue to move through the pandemic?
Well, thanks, Kathryn. Great to be with you all today. As you might imagine, the pandemic has raised a host of FMLA issues for employers and employees alike, and they've certainly thrown us, or the pandemic has certainly thrown us a curveball when it comes to a number of potential FMLA situations. You know, the employee who has COVID-19 and is in inpatient care or is doctoring up, clearly that's an FMLA situation. But what about those employees that are asymptomatic? They don't have any impact from COVID-19. They could work, but the CDC tells us that they need to quarantine at home. Is that an FMLA situation? Employees who have underlying health conditions and they're fearful to come to work. How do you handle those situations? And even taking it a step further, those employees who have family members with health conditions and they're worried about going to work, bringing COVID back home and impacting that family member. And so there's a whole host of issues that employers have been grappling with throughout the pandemic. And even, put aside FFCRA leave. That's a whole issue in itself that employers have been grappling with. But these new situations that have popped up because of this pandemic have created a host of issues for employers. And the common answer for all of these scenarios, the advice I'm giving employers is you've got to treat these situations as potential FMLA situations. It doesn't mean that it's going to be an FMLA leave in the end, but we certainly need to walk it down that process. And I think the biggest trap are the first two categories that I mentioned, that asymptomatic employee and the employee with an underlying health condition. For the asymptomatic employee, we've already seen a little bit of case law coming out of this pandemic, cautioning employers to avoid that employers avoid FMLA at their peril in these kinds of situations. Even that employee who doesn't show signs of COVID-19, they simply have a positive test, they're otherwise fine, but they're at home, we still, as employers, have to treat that as a potential FMLA situation. So I would advise employers to provide the notices, provide the medical certification, obtain that information from the employee, and then make some decisions about FMLA. Similar to that employee with an underlying health condition, the employee who has asthma or some kind of immune deficiency condition, and they're fearful of coming to work. I mean, let's face it. We don't know much of anything about this virus, right? Even more than a year into it. We'll know more about it 5 and 10 years from now when we don't have a need to know much about it at that point to impact today's decisions. So we've got to, again, handle these situations with care. For an employee that is telling you they've got a medical condition and they need leave as a result, that's a trigger for FMLA. Based on the FMLA regulations, we're going to find plenty of courts that are going to find in cases in the future that those statements, I have a medical condition and I need leave because of it, is enough at least to put the employer on notice of the possible need for FMLA leave. So again, walk through that process, the proper notices, the medical certification. Finally, for that employee who has a family member with a serious health condition and they're worried about infecting that family member, well, now we're going a little far afield from FMLA, so I think we can be a little bit more aggressive in those areas, but we've got to keep in mind employee relations considerations, even for those employees. And one last comment, one of the lasting impacts of this pandemic when it comes to family and medical leave, particularly family leave, childcare issues. We are going to continue as the American workforce is going to continue to grapple with childcare issues and how do we provide support for our employees who have childcare needs. We're seeing these pop up in various states in their paid leave programs, but keep an eye on what we might see in the road ahead at the federal level, because that is a very clear issue, a very difficult one for employees in any workforce. How do they balance work and family life moving forward?
Absolutely. You laid out a lot of great points. And I think it is worth mentioning, obviously, that stuff will continue even post-pandemic. So it'll be really interesting to kind of see how things shake out, certainly. Tamika, do you have any thoughts on, some of the things that were just mentioned and, anything you need to add as a leave administrator?
Oh, absolutely. Jeff hit a lot of the high points about issues that, generally people are facing dealing with FMLA situations. From a leave administration perspective, I mean, people come to leave administrators for accuracy, right? And, making sure that they're able to, get their eligibility determined correctly and entitlement determined correctly. And as you think about all of the factors that Jeff just talked about that have come to light in this pandemic, accurate information is just such a huge key piece of what we struggle with on the administration side and what the employers are struggling with. One major factor is, the FMLA requires 1,250 hours worked for someone to even be eligible for FMLA. Well, there were some employers that just presumed if we have a full-time employee, you can defer to the fact that they have 1,250 hours of eligibility. Well, we can't do that anymore with the pandemic. Some employers shut down altogether, had furloughs, and some people were actually sick, and some had to care for children, and the hours worked requirement wasn't met. And so we're dealing with employers who have large populations who aren't meeting the FMLA requirements but still have need for leave, and some of them are wanting to structure corporate leaves around lower hours work requirements, and we're working with them to make sure that their employee populations who need leave that they want to provide leave for but aren't technically eligible for FMLA anymore are now that they have a plan and a process for doing that. So the whole eligibility work locations, I mean, people are everywhere now. That's another big piece of the problem in terms of getting accurate information. Someone may be in, you have a situation where someone's in DC, but we think they're in Virginia, and, the law is different about what leave entitlement they have in those two very close locations. So getting that information right, not just from an administrative side, but from an employer side, trying to assist them in keeping up with where their people are actually working and what leave entitlements they have from those locations are all, super important pieces of the puzzle. And then the entitlements themselves, people are working schedules all over the place now. They're not necessarily all full-time, or, there's some are just not working in regular type jobs anymore. They've changed positions, due to the pandemic. So just keeping up with all of that information, keeping it accurate, and making sure that we're making the best decisions we can make as this pandemic continues to grow and evolve and change with the leave entitlements and the responsibilities of employers. We're working very closely hand in hand with employers to make sure that we're all on the same page and trying to make the best decisions for everyone involved.
Absolutely. You brought up a great point, which is that employees obviously are kind of everywhere right now. So of course, over the last year plus, we have seen such a rise in remote work and hybrid work, and that is expected to continue. But of course, like you said, I mean, that's going to be this whole new level of complexity for leave laws across state lines. So Daris, Jeff, either of you could speak to this. What are some of the best practices that you're seeing employers take to get ahead of that complexity?
You want me to start, Daris, and then you can jump in?
Please.
I really want to hear from Daris on this because she's so thoughtful on this remote employee issue. I've learned a lot from her over the years. FMLA and frankly other leave laws, they weren't built with the pandemic in mind. They had the traditional workplace in mind. And clearly, we've seen over the past 5-ish years, we've seen the movement toward remote work, and these questions start to arise. What laws apply to an employee where they don't have an actual workplace? They're working out of their home, for example. So those assumptions that come out of the FMLA and the regs, they kind of fell by the wayside in this pandemic as remote work has become a significant part of what we're doing right now. But what laws apply to this wandering worker? The FMLA tells us very basically that the work site is the office to which they report or they get assignments from. Okay, so that's one line in the FMLA regulations. Otherwise, we have very little else to go off of. We have very little case law dealing with these issues. So, in terms of how you handle this, make sure that you're discussing internally. Make sure you're discussing it with your legal counsel, because there are a number of considerations, not only where the employer is based, but where the employee is based. Is it temporary? Is there some permanency to it? What does the law say? Some laws say this law only applies in the state that you are in or that you work, so we may have some guidance from the law, but many laws don't. But it's not entirely clear whether or not they apply beyond the state lines. So really important to think through these issues and get the guidance you need from your legal counsel.
Yeah, Jeff, I think that's the challenge, especially with the state leave laws. I almost find the FMLA fairly easy, right? Because I don't care what state they're in, I care where they report to. But with the state laws, to your point, they didn't have remote workers in mind back when those laws were created, most of them. And I think their intent was, to protect their workers, what they considered their workers, those within their state boundaries. But now in this situation with remote workers, even before the pandemic, but obviously escalated now, an employee may be working from home. So are they a worker of the state they're sitting in, or are they a worker of, where they report into? And pre-pandemic, I think it was a little simpler because you were either permanent work at home or you were permanent in an office most of the time. And but the pandemic has brought this new challenge where they are remote, but to your point, maybe temporary. So where exactly are they from a work state perspective, and therefore what leave laws apply? And to your point with getting with counsel, I can't stress that enough, because this goes far beyond leave, right? I mean, you're also looking at when you start to determine where is my worker, right? Or what jurisdiction are they in from an employment perspective. Now you're also getting into things like work comp law or unemployment taxes, or, your payroll taxes, and in my space, the paid family medical leave statutory plans, right? New York PFL or Massachusetts PFML, and these are employees that are contributing to that out of their paychecks, right, to get the benefit. Well, do they continue to contribute if they are now working remotely from another state? I will say some states have issued some guidance on that. Washington and New York come to top of mind, talking about, hey, in in this circumstance, if the plan was always that they would be for example, a Washington worker, they're currently remote, but the plan is that is temporary. They will be coming back. Then you can consider them a Washington worker all throughout. But each state's a little different. Like I said, some have issued guidance, some have not. So therefore, that's where it gets really important to get with your counsel and work through that, because the impacts are pretty far-reaching.
Daris, you're freaking me out.
They need you, Jeff. They need
very
you.
Difficult issues.
So much for employers to pay attention to, especially as we kind of figure out if workers will continue to stay remote or if they're going to come back. I'm sure that's kind of, not exactly having a plan maybe. Does that complicate things, that if employers don't know exactly if their workers are going to come back or not, or stay remote or be hybrid?
I think it does, right? And again, to Jeff's point, I think that's why you start to sit down and look at the specific jurisdictions you're in with your counsel to figure that out. But I think most employers now, and I can speak for Unum, as one of those employers, plans are being put in place, right? Employers are the place with the vaccines, with everything reopening, to say, okay, we need a plan for our remote workforce, right? And what does that look like? What is the new world for us as far as remote work, and having that plan in place so that they can then kind of project, yep, we're in a temporary space, and by X date, we either know they're a work at home employee or they're a in the office employee, based on whether it's how many days per week they're at a certain location or hours or whatever rule they determine is appropriate in partnership with their counsel. But I think employers are starting to need to make the plan, and they are making the plans for either reentry or to change their approach to the workforce.
Absolutely. And Daris, I'm going to keep you talking because I wanted to ask you, about the paid leave landscape. Obviously, you were just kind of talking about it, but what's new? Can you kind of give us a little bit, some summary of, what the last 6 months has been like? What's top of mind for employers right now?
Yeah, so how much time do we have? It's been a lot going on in the last 6 months even. So, first of all, the COVID laws, right? Most of them that were passed early on during the pandemic that we all thought were going to last 3 months, 6 months, maybe the end of the year, right? A lot of states and cities went ahead and extended those after January 1st, and most are expiring this summer. I've seen some June, July timeframes. California is the end of September. Some of the laws just say, until the end of the declared public health emergency. So they're going to be at a state level or a city level based on the declaration of that government agency. So you have kind of those COVID things, but those are temporary. They are ending, absent anything that we can't predict, but it looks like those are going to be kind of sunsetting soon, which is good news. But I would say, if you don't know if you've got any of those COVID laws that apply to you, each state and city has a website, has FAQs, has information out there, and unfortunately, you just kind of got to look at the jurisdiction. Obviously, we've had a few laws passed too related to leave for actually vaccine time, so that's another piece that we've seen. Where we saw a lot of activity legislatively, with what we would call the paid family medical leaves, those family medical insurance programs that the states are doing now. We had 29 different states that introduced some kind of legislation this year. The good news is, at least, depending on whether you think it's good or bad, 20 of those proposals have already died. They're done. And legislative sessions ended. We still have 9 states with active proposals out there. Don't anticipate any of those will probably pass this year. I think most of it will be kind of laying the groundwork this year for more robust proposals next year. But with the pandemic lasting as long as it did, I think a lot of states are just still focused on recovery and budgetary issues and some of those things. But they did lay the groundwork there for proposals probably next year. Where there's a lot of talk right now, federal, right? Because you had Biden and his address to Congress recently and talking about the quote Biden plan. Not a lot of details on that other than kind of a fact sheet that's been released. Then in addition to that, The House Ways and Means Committee released an actual kind of full-blown proposal with full language for a federal paid family leave program. So, active conversations are obviously happening at a federal level around the need for paid leave. And it'll be interesting to see as those conversations develop and how much traction those get, what states may want to do. States may back off and kind of wait and see what the feds are going to do, or they may continue to plow forward in 2022. So I think the next 6 months to watch what happens federally is going to maybe dictate what we see in 2022 at a state level.
Perfect. And kind of going into this next phase of the pandemic, vaccine rates are on the rise. You were just talking about vaccines. And of course, workplaces are starting to open up more broadly. So in terms of returning people to the workplace, what are some of the key regulations to keep in mind in light of the ADA and the EEOC? Tamika, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yes, and if you weren't completely, nervous and shook by the FMLA part of the presentation, here's ADA. We've got yet another law that impacts this whole return to work process. And every employer, I think, is asking themselves at this point to mandate vaccinations or to not mandate vaccinations. I did a presentation earlier this week where at least half of the audience was saying they're in the process of trying to determine what that looks like and whether that makes sense for their organizations. Now, the ADA is the governing area of law for that particular issue, because the ADA is the area of law that says that COVID is a direct threat. And because COVID is a direct threat to the workplace, it allows an employer to implement policies to protect its workers and employees in the workplace. And that's still true. But other than that, the ADA is not super helpful in guiding how we navigate this process. So, the one thing that I've been advising employers to think about is, what are you going to do for those who say no? Because that's always the question. Are you going to have exceptions? My answer would be yes, you better have some exceptions to the mandate or to not mandate. And what do those look like? In terms of how to get at those answers, I'd say go back to ADA 101. We have to first start with, is a person disabled under the ADA, or do they have an underlying condition? Because that is another factor that the EEOC added to our consideration of this issue with the whole COVID mandate. And then if so, what in-work accommodations can you put in place that would help alleviate that risk and that threat? And so think through all of those issues, and be mindful of the fact too, we don't also only have medical issues in mind. Some people also have religious issues, that reasons they're not going to get the vaccination. Have a plan for what you're going to do in those instances as well. So it's a very difficult decision to make, because I think you have to have multiple layers of what if, and what I'm going to do in light of the decisions that employees and employers make. So, and keep in mind, we don't know what the EEOC is going to do with a lot of this. We don't know what the courts are going to do with a lot of this. So we're making it up as we go. I think as long as you have well-reasoned decisions about why you're making the determinations you're making and why you're making the exclusions you're making, you're going to always be in a better position than just saying, I'm just not doing it because. But it's a very difficult landscape to navigate right now, on top of all of the FMLA fun we're having.
Absolutely. Such a big issue, and obviously a big challenge. Jeff, anything to add on that?
Well, the vaccines and the vaccine news over the past week have really complicated things, right? For employers. A little over a week ago, we got the news from CDC that said vaccinated people don't have to wear masks virtually anywhere. And then OSHA says, yeah, we're gonna latch on to that, whatever CDC says. And employers are looking around wondering, all right, what do we do with this now? It presents some really difficult issues. And so 98% of the email coming into my inbox over the past week is, Jeff, can we treat vaccinated employees differently than non-vaccinated employees? Number one. And can we put some sticker on their badge or their ID that they've been vaccinated. Come up, give me answers, foolproof answers to those 2 questions and tell me now. Really tough issues. And we've got, 5 minutes left in this program. So maybe I'll leave you with a cliffhanger and make you follow this program in the future, because we simply can't give you all the analysis involved. I can, in a qualified way, share that, yes, generally speaking, on the face of it, you can treat vaccinated folks different than non-vaccinated folks, except in Montana, where they are the only state that tells us we can't do that. There are a host of laws pending in various state legislatures that would do the same. But generally speaking, yes, you could come up with a program to treat them both differently. And yes, I'm finding that employers are generally starting to think about stickers or badges or some kind of similar way of identifying who is vaccinated and therefore doesn't have to wear a mask at work. But don't take my simplistic answer here as the gospel. This is an issue. Again, I hate to sound like an attorney, but it's something you've got to discuss with your legal counsel, because there are all kinds of different issues to be thinking about as you're making policy, as you're asking employees to make certain representations upon their return to work about their vaccination status. But it presents yet the latest issue for employers in this pandemic.
Absolutely. Yeah, the news was certainly huge last week, and I do not envy any of you who are giving advice to employers right now. There's a lot certainly to navigate. We just to kind of wrap things up, I think a good place is, Jeff, you did kind of mention, some advice, but, any best practices on how to practically do a lot of this and to lead this return to work strategy. Obviously, there's those new kind of complications as far as the vaccinations and the mask mandates. But any advice, any best practices? Tamika, yeah.
Go ahead, Tamika. Do you want to lead us off there?
Oh, sure. My thought was initially it would be great to lead a return to work strategy when people wanted to return to work, right? I mean, the biggest issue that everyone is struggling with is work from home, and people who've been working from home that don't want to return to the workplace. And so assessing those work from home arrangements, whether they were temporary, hopefully you've declared them temporary, that helps, as opposed to just saying people are work from home indefinitely. Those are things that we're recommending employers do to try to get that portion of the population back to work. And job descriptions are going to be huge. We've had one case out of the federal district in Tennessee so far where a court said, if you want working in the office to be an essential function of the job, you should put that in the job description. It should be clear by the job duties that this person needs to be in the office. That's new. And we're getting new information and new input every day from courts and the EEOC. And so being mindful of those things and jumping on top of that is a great best practice, I think. And in general, like for vaccinated people, non-vaccinated people, there are going to be some people who are vaccinated who don't want to work with unvaccinated people. Figuring out what those in-work accommodations are going to be. I mean, are you going to continue to require masks for certain areas of the population or certain areas of the building, or do you keep 6 feet distance in your desking, like we're doing at Unum, just to keep people comfortable? There's a whole lot of options, and different workplaces are going to require different considerations, of course. But being mindful of those things, being flexible is going to be key, and staying on top of the latest information is the best advice I think I can give right now. I know, Jeff, you had something else too.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. Think about a transition. Think about, like you pointed out, think about being flexible. The worst thing that we can do as employers is have a mindset that, okay, tomorrow or June 1st, everyone is coming back to the office, no matter what position you are, no matter what you do. take a targeted approach as to who needs to come back physically on site. It's going to be tough to defend a position that says, well, we need to have all managers back to the workplace because we need to show the importance of being physically back at the workplace. Well, there are individualized assessments that need to be made here. Think through those decisions before you start taking a blanket approach to these return to work situations.
That's great. Those are great pieces of advice, and I think a great place to kind of wrap up as well, because we are at time, unfortunately. I know I could speak to you guys for so much longer because you have such great insights, but we're going to leave it there. Thank you to all of you, Jeff, Tamika, Daris, for the time today, the wonderful and important insights. I know I got a lot out of it, and I'm sure everyone listening did as well. And speaking of which, thank you to everyone who has tuned in and watched this afternoon. See you all next time. And thanks again, guys.
Thanks,
Kathryn.
Kathryn.